4:15 in the morning. The destroyer USS Carney led the formation into the narrowest neck of the Strait of Hormuz. The ship was running at modified battle stations, with every sensor tuned to the jagged, dark coastline of QESHM Island. Somewhere in the shadows of the coastal cliffs, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps was preparing a strike that the United States Navy was determined to preempt. The night air was heavy with the smell of salt and the oily residue of heavy shipping traffic common in these waters. The Persian Gulf was unusually flat, a black mirror reflecting nothing but the dim glow of distant gas flares on the horizon. The two Arleigh Burke-class destroyers moved with a calculated silence that belied the massive power contained within their steel hulls. Destroyer DDG-64, known to the fleet as the USS Carney, maintained a steady speed of 22 knots to minimize the acoustic signature of its wake. 2,000 yards astern, the USS Mason held its position with disciplined precision, its own lights extinguished, and its radar sets operating in a restricted, low probability of intercept mode. On the bridge of the Carney, the commanding officer stood near the center console, his eyes fixed on the soft blue light of the tactical display. The mission was a direct response to 48 hours of escalating provocations against commercial tankers transiting the international shipping lanes. Intelligence from regional headquarters indicated that the Iranian base on QESHM Island had moved several mobile anti-ship cruise missile batteries into firing positions overlooking the channel. The primary objective of the United States formation was to neutralize these threats before they could be used to close the world's most critical energy choke point. The tactical plan called for a close-in engagement utilizing the rapid-fire capability of the 5-inch Mark 45 naval guns to minimize collateral damage to nearby civilian infrastructure. Inside the Combat Information Center, the air was cool and smelled of ozone and recycled oxygen from the ship's ventilation system. Dozens of sailors sat before glowing screens, their faces illuminated by the green and yellow symbols of the Aegis combat system. The tactical action officer adjusted his headset, listening to the digitized reports coming in from a Predator drone loitering 10,000 feet above the target area. The drone's infrared cameras showed heat signatures from several heavy vehicles moving near the main pier of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard base. These were the targets the destroyers had traveled through the night to find. At exactly 4:35 in the morning, the Carney reached its designated firing point. At coordinates 26 degrees 40 minutes north, 55 degrees 52 minutes east. The ship began a slow, graceful turn to starboard, bringing its forward 5-inch gun mount to bear on the island. The USS Mason followed the maneuver perfectly, splitting the formation to provide a wider field of fire, and to complicate any potential counter-battery efforts from the shore. The tension on the bridge was palpable, a silent weight that pressed down on every sailor. As the final seconds of the approach ticked away, the electronic warfare suite on the Carney began to pick up the faint, rhythmic pulse of an Iranian coastal surveillance radar searching the water. The enemy was beginning to wake up, sensing the presence of the two massive warships, lurking just 5 miles off their coast. On the tactical net, the weapon system operators confirmed that the target coordinates for the base headquarters and the primary fuel depot had been locked into the fire control computer. The twin ships were now less than 6 minutes away from the scheduled commencement of the strike. The deck beneath the sailors' feet vibrated with the steady hum of the 4 gas turbine engines, providing the immediate power necessary for high-speed maneuvers should the situation turn violent. The commanding officer checked the time on the master clock, seeing the numbers roll over to 4:39. Every sailor on the ship knew that once the first round left the barrel, the period of quiet professional observation would be over. The strategic silence of the Strait of Hormuz was about to be shattered by the sound of American naval power. The decision to authorize a kinetic strike against the QESHM Island facility was not reached in haste, but followed a series of escalating incidents that threatened the stability of global energy markets. For 72 hours leading up to the mission, United States Central Command had monitored a significant increase in aggressive maneuvers by Iranian fast attack craft against merchant vessels. The intelligence community provided high-confidence reporting that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps had deployed 10 mobile anti-ship cruise missile launchers to the southern tip of the island. These assets, capable of striking any vessel within the narrow shipping lanes of the Strait of Hormuz, represented a clear and present danger to international navigation. The formal execution order arrived at the headquarters of the 5th Fleet in Bahrain at 10 in the evening, on the 11th of January. The directive, issued by the Commander of Central Command, was specific and limited in scope to avoid a broader regional conflagration. The objective was the surgical destruction of the missile storage bunkers, the primary radar installations, and the coastal command center on QESHM. By neutralizing these specific nodes, the United States aimed to strip away the offensive capability of the local Iranian forces while signaling a firm commitment to the freedom of navigation. Across the deck of the USS Carney, the humid night air clung to the sailors, carrying the heavy scent of marine diesel and the sharp, metallic tang of the ship's superstructure. The environment in the strait was oppressive, a physical reminder of the strategic pressure cooker in which these crews operated daily. Despite the heat, the professional discipline of the crew remained absolute, with every member of the boarding teams and gun crews verifying their equipment for the 3rd time in as many hours. The mission was a test of the Navy's ability to project power with extreme precision in a highly contested environment. The tactical briefing, conducted in the wardroom hours earlier, had emphasized the importance of the rules of engagement. The United States Navy was not seeking to destroy the entire base, but rather to perform a functional defeat of the missile threat. The planners at Central Command had identified 3 primary target sets: the long-range coastal surveillance radar atop the central ridgeline, the hardened ammunition storage shelters located 500 yards inland from the pier, and the mobile launch vehicles themselves. Success would be measured not just by the destruction of the targets, but by the prevention of any successful Iranian counterstrike against the 2 destroyers. To ensure the safety of the task force, the operation was synchronized with broader regional assets. An E-3 Sentry airborne warning and control aircraft was loitering 5,000 feet over the Gulf of Oman, providing a comprehensive picture of the airspace for hundreds of miles. Additionally, a flight of 4 FA-18 Super Hornets from the Carrier Strike Group further south was on station, ready to provide immediate close air support should the Iranian Air Force attempt to intervene. This layered defense was a hallmark of the American approach to high-stakes maritime operations, ensuring that the destroyers could focus entirely on their surface targets. The operational context was further complicated by the proximity of civilian shipping. At any given moment, dozens of massive oil tankers and container ships were within 30 miles of the planned engagement zone. The commanding officers of the Carney and the Mason had to ensure that their firing arcs remained clear of these neutral vessels, a task requiring constant coordination with the vessel traffic services in the region. The tactical action officers utilized the most advanced digital mapping software to plot the exact location of every radar return in the strait, distinguishing between hostile military targets and innocent commercial traffic. As the clock ticked toward the designated hour, the political stakes were as high as the military risks. The strike on Endig-Tenturi, QESHM, was intended to be a proportional response, a message sent in the language of kinetic force that certain red lines could not be crossed without consequence. The professionalism of the sailors aboard the 2 destroyers was the primary tool of this diplomacy. Each man and woman understood that their performance over the next 60 minutes would have implications far beyond the immediate tactical horizon. The transition from observation to engagement was now inevitable, and the ships were prepared to execute their orders with the cold efficiency for which the United States Navy is known. 4:42 in the morning. Deep within the steel heart of the USS Carney, the electronic warfare bay was a hive of silent, high-stakes activity. While the rest of the ship prepared for the physical shock of gunfire, the electronic warfare technicians were already engaged in a silent duel that would determine the success of the entire mission. The primary tool for this invisible combat was the ANSLQ-32 Victor 6 electronic warfare suite, a system capable of identifying, deceptive jamming, and blinding enemy radars with surgical precision. The air in the compartment was kept at exactly 68 degrees to protect the massive server racks, creating a sharp, dry contrast to the thick, humid air pressing against the hull outside. The mission required the United States Navy to achieve total electronic superiority before the first 5-inch shell was even chambered. On the coastal heights of QESHM Island, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard operated several high-powered search radars, including the older Russian-made Square Tie, and more modern domestically produced systems. These eyes were scanning the water, looking for the telltale radar returns of the two American destroyers. If the Iranians could lock onto the ships, they could provide targeting data to the anti-ship cruise missile batteries hidden in the nearby valleys. The electronic warfare supervisor, a first-class petty officer with 10 years of experience, watched as a jagged yellow pulse appeared on his primary display. The system instantly identified the frequency as an Iranian coastal surveillance radar attempting to sweep the Carney's position. He did not wait for an order. The rules of engagement for this phase were clear. He manipulated a trackball with his right hand, centering a digital cursor over the hostile signal, and initiated the jamming sequence. A massive surge of electromagnetic energy, measured in tens of thousands of watts, was channeled into the ship's outboard antennas. This was not a blunt, crude wall of noise, but a sophisticated, digitized signal designed to mimic and then overwhelm the Iranian radar's own pulses. To the Iranian radar operators on QESHM Island, their screens did not simply go black. They were suddenly filled with thousands of false targets, flickering and dancing across the glass until the entire display was washed out by a solid wall of white electronic snow. 2,000 yards astern, the USS Mason coordinated its own electronic attack. The two ships worked in a master and slave configuration, alternating their jamming frequencies to ensure that there were no gaps in the electronic curtain. This synchronized effort created a digital fog that extended for 15 miles around the task force. The Iranian technicians on shore likely suspected that their equipment was being jammed, but the sophistication of the American system made it impossible for them to find a clear frequency to burn through the interference. Inside the Combat Information Center, the hum of high-powered cooling fans provided a rhythmic backdrop to the technical reports. The tactical action officer checked his screen, seeing that the Iranian radar emissions had become erratic, jumping between frequencies in a desperate attempt to regain a lock. Each time the enemy shifted, the ANSLQ-32 followed them, in less than a millisecond, blanketing the new frequency before a single coherent return could be established. The smell of hot electronics and ozone filled the small room, a byproduct of the massive power being cycled through the ship's internal systems. The commanding officer of the Carney watched the status board, which now showed a green light for electronic suppression. The invisible battle was being won. By blinding the coastal surveillance network, the United States destroyers had effectively disappeared from the enemy's tactical picture, even though they were less than 10 miles from the beach. This gave the ships the critical advantage of surprise, allowing them to move into their final firing positions without the threat of a preemptive missile launch from the shore. As the ships closed the distance, the electronic warfare team remained vigilant. They were not just looking for search radars, but also for the high-frequency handshake of a missile's active seeker head. If a missile were launched, the electronic warfare suite would be the first line of defense, using deceptive signals to trick the incoming weapon into thinking. The ship was several miles away from its actual position. For now, however, the goal was total silence through total noise. The digital fog was holding, and the path to the target was clear. 4:55 in the morning. The quiet of the Persian Gulf was about to be replaced by the roar of solid rocket propellant. Aboard the USS Carney, the deck forward of the bridge was a grid of 64 steel cells known as the Mark 41 vertical launch system. Inside several of these armored tubes sat Tomahawk land attack missiles, each a 6-meter-long instrument of precision. The mission to neutralize the Iranian air defense network on QESHM Island was the essential precursor to the gun strike, ensuring that no surface-to-air missiles could threaten the circling drone. or the FA-18 Super Hornets, loitering just over the horizon. The tactical action officer in the Combat Information Center called out the final authorization. The atmosphere in the room was electric. The air chilled to preserve the sensitive computers that were now calculating the flight path for the missiles. The Tomahawks would not fly in a straight line. Their internal guidance system was programmed with a complex series of waypoints, designed to hug the terrain of the island and approach the Iranian H-Q-9 surface-to-air missile batteries from the blind side of the central ridgeline. VLS, battery release, the weapons officer announced. A split second later, the forward deck of the Carney erupted. A heavy steel hatch slammed open, and a Tomahawk cruise missile shrieked out of its cell. A massive column of white smoke and orange flame punched upward, momentarily illuminating the entire ship in a blinding, flickering light. The heat from the booster rocket was so intense it could be felt through the thick glass of the bridge windows, and the acrid smell of burnt chemical propellant washed over the forward superstructure. The missile climbed straight up for 100 feet, before its solid fuel booster fell away and its small turbofan engine ignited with a high-pitched whine. Two more missiles followed in rapid succession from the USS Mason. The night sky was torn apart by three distinct trails of white exhaust, arching over the black water toward the silhouettes of the QESHM cliffs. These were the latest Block 5 versions of the Tomahawk, capable of being redirected in flight and possessing an improved sensor suite for terminal guidance. They flew at a speed of 550 miles per hour, staying just 50 feet above the surface of the sea to remain below the horizon of any remaining Iranian radars. On the shore, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard units were only now beginning to realize the scale of the incoming strike. The Tomahawks crossed the coastline at three separate points, their wings extended and their internal cameras scanning the dark terrain for the specific signatures of the H-Q-9 radar vehicles. The environment of the island, a mix of rugged limestone hills and salt flats, flashed beneath the missile's sensors in a blur of gray and brown. The smell of the sea was replaced at the impact sites by the sudden, sharp scent of ozone and the impending heat of high explosives. The first Tomahawk reached its target 4 minutes after launch. The H-Q-9 radar vehicle, a massive truck-mounted system located on a plateau overlooking the southern beach, never had the chance to fire. The 1,000-pound warhead detonated exactly 3 meters above the vehicle to maximize the fragmentation effect. The blast wave flattened every structure within a 50-meter radius, sending shards of hot metal and glass flying through the air. A massive fireball erupted, fueled by the truck's diesel and the volatile chemicals within the radar's cooling systems. The second and third missiles struck the missile storage bunkers and the primary command van with equal precision. The impact on the bunkers was particularly violent. The penetrating warheads punched through 2 meters of reinforced concrete before detonating, causing the entire hillside to shudder. Secondary explosions from the Iranian interceptor missiles stored inside sent plumes of white-hot fire shooting out of the bunker entrances, lighting up the sky for miles. The air defense network of QESHM Island was functionally dead. Inside the Carney, the bridge team watched the real-time feed from the Predator drone. The infrared images showed 3 distinct white blossoms on the map, signifying successful impacts. There was no celebration, only a grim professional focus as the ship transitioned to the next phase of the operation. The path was now clear for the destroyers to move into their final firing positions for the 5-inch guns. 5 in the morning. The darkness over the Strait of Hormuz was now punctured by the oily orange glow of the burning missile batteries on QESHM. While the Tomahawk strikes had been successful, they had also alerted every Iranian unit on the island that the engagement had shifted from a standoff to a hot war. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps did not remain passive. From a concealed, reinforced concrete garage tucked into a ravine, 3 miles north of the main base, 2 mobile launchers for the Noor anti-ship cruise missile lurched into the open. The Iranian crews worked with frantic speed, knowing that the American destroyers would be looking for them. Within 90 seconds of the Tomahawk impacts, the first Iranian missile cleared its launch rail. A streak of white-hot fire erupted from the ravine, the solid fuel booster pushing the missile through a low arc toward the water. A second missile followed 4 seconds later. Both weapons dropped to an altitude of 20 meters, their active seeker heads scanning the black surface of the Gulf for the massive radar cross-sections of the Carney and the Mason. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Carney, the atmosphere shifted from controlled observation to the high-velocity rhythm of a defensive engagement. The electronic warfare supervisor was the first to shout, "Vampire! Vampire!" Multiple inbound contacts from the shoreline, bearing 035, range 12 miles, and closing. The Aegis combat system, the most sophisticated air defense network in the world, reacted in milliseconds. On the bridge, the sudden, high-pitched warble of the incoming missile alarm cut through the hum of the ventilation. The commanding officer gripped the arms of his chair, his eyes fixed on the primary tactical display. The air in the compartment felt thick, the temperature seemingly rising as the ship's massive Spy-6 radar arrays pumped out maximum power to track the sea-skimming threats. Engage with rolling airframe missiles. Forward mount. Auto-engage. The tactical action officer commanded. Aboard the Carney, the RIM-116 rolling airframe missile launcher, a compact box mounted atop the forward superstructure, slewed with violent speed to the northeast. Two small missiles, designed for high-speed terminal defense, shrieked out of their canisters. They spun rapidly in flight to maintain stability. Their dual-mode infrared and radio frequency seekers locked onto the heat of the incoming Iranian Noors. The first defensive intercept occurred 4 miles from the ship. The rolling airframe missile collided head-on with the first Iranian Noor. The result was a blinding white flash that bleached the darkness of the Gulf for a fraction of a second. The Iranian missile's 500-pound warhead detonated prematurely, shredding the airframe and sending a cloud of burning wreckage tumbling into the sea. The shockwave of the mid-air explosion reached the Carney 3 seconds later, a dull thud that vibrated through the steel hull and rattled the bridge windows. The second Iranian missile was more persistent. It executed a pre-programmed pop-up maneuver, climbing to 100 feet. Just as it neared the task force to dive onto the ship's deck, the Carney's close-in weapon system, the R2-D2-shaped 20mm Gatling gun, whirred into life. It fired a burst of 75 tungsten armor-piercing rounds in a single second, the sound like a giant piece of canvas being ripped apart. The stream of tracers reached out into the night, stitching a line of fire across the sky. The Iranian Noor took a direct hit to its guidance section. The missile didn't explode immediately. Instead, it veered wildly to the left, its wings clipped by the 20mm rounds. It slammed into the water less than 800 yards from the Carney's port beam, erupting in a towering geyser of white water and burning fuel. The smell of burnt powder and ozone from the close-in weapon system drifted back into the ship's intakes, a sharp chemical reminder of how close the threat had come. Clear air, no further contacts, the radar operator reported, his voice tight but steady. The first Iranian counterpunch had been parried. 5:10 in the morning, the USS Carney and the USS Mason reached their final firing blocks, just 4 miles off the coast of QESHM Island. The two destroyers turned in perfect synchronization, presenting their full broadsides to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard base. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability and maximum power. The massive Mark 45 Mod 4 5-inch guns, capable of firing 20 rounds per minute, were already elevated, their long barrels slewing toward the primary target, the hardened command center and the main vehicle park, where the Iranian Revolutionary Guard was attempting to mobilize its remaining forces. The order was given over the tactical net. Batteries released. All mounts, rapid fire, high explosive. Engage. The Carney's forward gun mount bucked as the first 70-pound shell was propelled from the barrel by a massive charge of smokeless powder. A 2-meter tongue of orange flame lashed out into the darkness, followed by a shockwave that compressed the air across the entire foredeck. The sound was not a bang, but a sharp, physical crack that could be felt in the marrow of every sailor's bones. Inside the gun turret, the automated loading system whirred with mechanical violence, slamming a fresh shell and powder casing into the breech every 3 seconds. The smell of hot steel and acrid cordite smoke instantly filled the air, drawn back toward the bridge by the ship's forward motion. On the shore, the impact was catastrophic. The first volley of 5-inch shells punched straight through the reinforced concrete roof of the Central Command building, detonating deep inside the structure. The building did not merely collapse. It erupted outward as the high-explosive warheads turned the internal walls into high-velocity fragments. A massive pillar of black smoke and pulverized masonry rose 300 feet into the air, illuminated from within by a secondary explosion. As the facility's electrical transformers blew apart, the heat from the blast was so intense it scorched the palm trees surrounding the compound, turning them into blackened skeletons in a matter of seconds. The Iranian defenders attempted to return fire with heavy Zu-23 anti-aircraft guns, moved into a ground fire role, but the response was disorganized and frantic. Tracers from the shore streaked across the water, in wild, inaccurate arcs, most falling short or passing high over the Carney's masts. The American destroyers ignored the small-caliber fire, their 5-inch guns continuing their rhythmic, devastating work. One shell struck a fuel tanker parked near the main pier, and the vehicle vanished in a towering mushroom of liquid fire that sent a wall of heat washing across the beach. The blast wave was so powerful, it blew the windows out of every structure within 400 yards and threw several Iranian fast boats clear out of the water. The barrage shifted toward the mobile launcher park. 6 M109 pattern artillery pieces, which the Iranians had been attempting to deploy, were caught in the open. A single 4-round spread from the Mason's gun tore into the formation. The impact of the 70-pound shells shredded the light armor of the vehicles, sending turret hatches and track links flying into the air like scrap metal. One artillery piece suffered a catastrophic ammunition cook-off. The entire vehicle disintegrated in a white flash, leaving nothing behind but a smoking crater in the salt-cracked earth. The surviving Iranian personnel broke cover, running toward the ridgelines as the ground beneath them continued to heave and erupt under the relentless American fire. The aftermath was a scene of total tactical devastation. The main base on QESHM Island was no longer a functioning military installation. It was a sprawling landscape of fire, twisted metal, and thick, choking smoke that blotted out the early morning stars. The sound of the 5-inch guns finally ceased, leaving a dead silence that was broken only by the crackle of burning fuel and the distant, rhythmic thud of secondary explosions rippling through the ruined bunkers. The Carney and the Mason began their slow turn, back toward the open water, their gun barrels still smoking, and the air around them thick with the scent of victory and burnt powder. 5:25 in the morning. Although the main battery of the 5-inch guns had fallen silent, the destruction on QESHM Island was only entering its most violent phase. The initial bombardment had served as a key to a much larger, more volatile lock. Deep beneath the surface of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard base lay a network of interconnected storage tunnels, filled with thousands of gallons of marine diesel, volatile rocket propellant, and stockpiles of legacy munitions. The precision of the American naval gunfire had breached the ventilation shafts and access points of these underground chambers, allowing tongues of liquid fire to lick deep into the heart of the facility. The first major secondary explosion occurred near the main pier. A fuel line, severed by a stray fragment from the earlier strike, finally succumbed to the heat. A localized flash was followed by a low, guttural roar that seemed to vibrate the very seabed beneath the two destroyers. A massive gout of burning fuel erupted from a subterranean tank, shooting upward like a volcanic geyser. The liquid fire cascaded over the remaining infrastructure of the pier, melting the mooring lines of several fast attack boats that had survived the initial barrage. These vessels, now adrift and engulfed in flames, floated out into the channel like funeral pyres, their own onboard ammunition cooking off in a series of sharp, staccato pops. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Mason, the tactical action officer watched the infrared feed from the loitering drone. The target area was no longer a collection of distinct buildings. It was a single, massive heat signature that threatened to saturate the drone's sensors. Target Alpha is completely neutralized, the operator reported. Secondary explosions are continuing throughout the northern sector. The structural integrity of the main bunker complex is failing. As he spoke, a massive section of the central ridgeline seemed to lift and then settle in a cloud of white limestone dust. A large ammunition cache, likely containing several hundred older artillery shells, had detonated simultaneously. The pressure wave from this underground explosion was so great that it blew the heavy steel blast doors of the northern tunnel entrance. 5:45 in the morning. Even as the primary base on QESHM Island became a cauldron of fire and secondary detonations, a new threat emerged from the rugged limestone heights to the northwest. Iranian Revolutionary Guard artillery crews, having survived the initial Tomahawk strikes by sheltering in deep mountain galleries, began to emerge. They deployed several towed 122mm D-30 howitzers onto small, pre-prepared concrete pads overlooking the channel. These units, though primitive compared to the Aegis system, were capable of lobbing high-explosive shells at the destroyers as they began their transition to open water. The first Iranian shell hit the water 300 yards off the starboard quarter of the USS Mason. The explosion sent a tall, white plume of seawater into the air. The sound a dull, flat thump that echoed off the nearby cliffs. A second shell followed moments later, closer this time, walking the fire toward the ship's midsection. The environment around the task force was now a chaotic mix of dawn light, rising black smoke from the base, and the sudden, sharp splashes of hostile incoming fire. The air smelled of salt and the distant, bitter tang of the burning island. Inside the Carney's Combat Information Center, the counter-battery radar system, the AN/SPY-6, instantly backtracked the trajectory of the incoming shells. Within 3 seconds, a digital cursor on the tactical display locked onto the exact coordinates of the Iranian gun positions on the ridgeline. The information was automatically shared between the two ships via the Link 16 data network. The destroyers did not need to turn back. The 5-inch guns were more than capable of reaching over their shoulders to strike the heights. Counter-battery fire. Auto lead. The tactical action officer ordered. Engage target Tango 7 through Tango 11. The USS Carney's 5-inch gun mount slewed upward, its long barrel reaching an elevation of 40 degrees. The gun fired 3 rapid rounds. Because the targets were on higher ground, the shells followed a high arcing trajectory, clearing the coastal cliffs and plunging into the ravine, where the D-30 howitzers were positioned. The high explosive rounds struck the rocky ground with incredible violence, the shards of limestone and steel fragments creating a lethal spray that shredded the artillery crews and their equipment. The first Iranian gun position was silenced instantly, its crew consumed by a cloud of gray dust and orange flame. The USS Mason engaged the remaining 3 guns on the ridge. The precision of the American fire was surgical. Rather than carpet bombing the hillside, the 5-inch rounds struck the specific concrete pads identified by the radar. One shell hit an Iranian ammunition limber, a small trailer filled with powder charges. The resulting explosion was a brilliant white flash that momentarily blinded the low-light cameras on the bridge. The entire artillery position was wiped off the ridgeline, leaving behind nothing but scorched rock and the mangled remains of the gun carriage. From the bridge of the Carney, the commanding officer watched the ridgeline through stabilized binoculars. He saw the final Iranian gun attempt to fire one last time, the muzzle flash a tiny spark against the dark mountain. Before the shell could even land in the water, a 2-gun salvo from the Carney struck the position. The top of the ridge seemed to disintegrate, the explosion throwing a massive boulder down the slope and crushing the access road the Iranians had used to reach the heights. The counter-battery engagement had lasted exactly 4 minutes. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic wash of the Gulf against the hull. The Iranian artillery threat had been systematically dismantled before it could score a single hit on the American vessels. The sailors on deck, protected by their flash gear and helmets, felt the heat from the gun barrels radiating into the cool morning air. The ridgelines of QESHM were now as silent as the ruined base below them. The counter-battery suppression was complete, ensuring a clear path for the task force to move into the deep water of the Gulf of Oman. 6:15 in the morning. As the first true light of dawn began to gray the horizon, the kinetic phase of the operation transitioned. into the cold, analytical phase of battle damage assessment. High above the smoke and the ruined ridgelines, the MQ-9 Reaper drone callsign Ghostwalker steadied its multispectral targeting system. The air at 10,000 feet was thin and freezing, a sharp contrast to the furnace-like heat still radiating from the surface of QESHM Island. The drone's sensors, capable of reading a license plate from 2 miles up, began a systematic sweep of the impact zones to confirm the functional defeat of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard facility. The real-time data stream was piped directly into the intelligence center of the USS Carney. On the high-definition monitors, the black and white thermal imagery showed the island as a series of stark, glowing white hotspots against a cold, dark background. The primary command and control center was no longer a structure. It was a sprawling, jagged crater filled with cooling debris. The drone operator zoomed in on the central bunker complex, noting that the reinforced concrete slab had buckled and collapsed into the lower levels, confirming that the Tomahawk and 5-inch shell penetrations had reached the structural foundations. Target Alpha 1. 100% destruction. The intelligence officer reported. Primary C2 node is non-operational. No signs of life or organized activity in the central sector. The camera shifted to the coastal missile sites. The drone's infrared sensors picked up the twisted, cooling husks of the mobile launchers that had been caught in the initial barrage. The thermal signatures of the Noor anti-ship missiles, which had burned out in their canisters, appeared as bright, elongated streaks against the scorched earth. The battle damage assessment confirmed that all 10 identified launchers had been neutralized. The surrounding vehicle park was a graveyard of blackened frames and melted rubber, with the smell of scorched diesel and ozone likely lingering for miles downwind. A secondary sweep of the northern ridgeline confirmed the success of the counter-battery fire. The drone's laser rangefinder mapped the 3 D-30 howitzer positions, showing the shattered remains of the gun carriages and the deep craters where the Carney's 5-inch shells had impacted with surgical precision. The ridgeline access road was blocked by hundreds of tons of fallen limestone, effectively trapping any surviving Iranian equipment in the higher elevations. The intelligence team marked these targets as K-kill, signifying a total and permanent kinetic destruction. The environment of the base was now one of absolute ruin. The primary fuel depot continued to bleed thick, greasy smoke into the morning sky, the fire having consumed nearly 60,000 gallons of marine fuel. The drone's sensors detected no movement from the Iranian fastboat piers. The vessels that hadn't been sunk were either grounded or adrift, charred by the intense radiant heat of the secondary explosions. The operational capacity of the IRGC on southern QESHM had been reduced to 0. Inside the Carney, the commanding officer reviewed the consolidated report. The mission had achieved every strategic objective set by Central Command. The eyes of the island were blind, its teeth were pulled, and its ability to coordinate attacks on the shipping lanes was extinguished. The battle damage was not just physical. It was a total disruption of the enemy's local military ecosystem. The Reaper drone continued its slow, mechanical orbit, a silent witness to the efficiency of the strike as the 2 destroyers prepared for the final phase of the morning. 6:30 in the morning. The sun finally broke over the horizon of the Gulf of Oman, casting long, golden streaks across the wake of the USS Carney and the USS Mason. The 2 destroyers were now 12 miles clear of the QESHM Island coastline, moving at a steady 30 knots toward the deep water patrol zones of the North Arabian Sea. Behind them, a massive, leaning pillar of black smoke served as a silent monument to the morning's work, stretching high into the clear blue sky before being sheared off by the high-altitude winds. The air on the open sea was crisp and carried the refreshing scent of salt spray, a welcome relief from the acrid, chemical stench of the combat zone. Inside the Carney, the high-pitched general quarters alarm was finally silenced, replaced by the steady, calm voice of the executive officer over the ship-wide announcing system. Secure from battle stations. Revert to modified condition 3, readiness. Set the morning watch. Across the ship, hundreds of sailors began the transition from the adrenaline-fueled intensity of combat to the grueling, meticulous work of post-engagement maintenance. The deck was still littered with the brass casings from the close-in weapon system, and the forward 5-inch gun mount was still radiating a shimmering haze of heat into the morning air. The final readiness report was compiled in the Combat Information Center and transmitted via secure satellite link to 5th Fleet Headquarters in Bahrain. The statistics were a testament to the efficiency of the Arleigh Burke-class platform. The task force had expended 3 Tomahawk land attack missiles, 2 rolling airframe missiles, and 185 rounds of 5-inch high-explosive ammunition. All primary and secondary targets on QESHM Island were confirmed destroyed. Most importantly, the personnel report for both the Carney and the Mason was clear: 0 casualties and no damage to either vessel. On the bridge, the commanding officer accepted a cup of coffee from a young seaman, his first since the operation began. He stood at the starboard side window, watching the Mason maintain its station on their flank. The professionalism of the crew had been absolute. From the electronic warfare technicians who blinded the enemy to the gun crews who delivered the final blow, the ship had functioned as a single, lethal organism. The strike was a reminder to the region that while the United States Navy preferred the quiet stability of the shipping lanes, it possessed a reach that was both long and devastatingly precise. The strategic ripple effects of the strike were already being felt across the globe. International shipping agencies were being notified that the immediate missile threat in the Strait of Hormuz had been neutralized, allowing the flow of global energy to resume its normal rhythm. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps had lost a critical projection node, and the cost of their recent provocations had been written in the ruins of their most prized coastal facility. The deterrent message had been delivered with the unmistakable weight of American naval steel. As the ships reached the blue water of the open sea, the crews began the process of cleaning the salt and soot from the superstructures. The gun barrels were swabbed, the sensor arrays were inspected for heat stress, and the internal ammunition hoists were reloaded from the deep magazines. The Carney and the Mason were not heading home. They were simply moving to their next station. In the high-stakes game of maritime security, the price of peace was constant: readiness and the demonstrated will to use force when the red lines were crossed. The sun was now fully up, bleaching the dark water into a brilliant, sparkling turquoise. The smoke from QESHM Island was a mere smudge on the western horizon, a fading memory of a battle that had lasted less than 2 hours but had reshaped the tactical reality of the Persian Gulf. The 2 destroyers sailed on, their silhouettes sharp against the morning light, ready for whatever the next watch might bring.